Chapter 30. Myron had held Grace's hand, trying to make it look like they were a happy couple as they'd hurried across the open area to the woods. They probably hadn't been visible for a full minute. What were the chances anybody had seen them? Slim, very slim. You're the god of miracles, though. Save us. They'd stepped into the thick forest and walked a few hundred yards along a trail. They were moving fast enough to stay warm. The snow fell steadily, silently, all around. In the places where it didn't get caught on branches and needles overhead, it was already starting to accumulate. Myron's flashlight beam bounced ahead on the trail. Aside from that, the forest was dark and deep. After about 10 minutes, Grace spotted the outline of some sort of all-terrain vehicle. It had a high top and a plastic windshield. The doors had been removed, or maybe it had never had doors to begin with. As they approached, Myron aimed his flashlight at the flat cargo area behind the two front seats, where a pile of blankets had been dumped. No, not a pile. Just one blanket, and it shifted as they approached. A bark cut through the silent night, and Regis poked his head out. Myron said, "Regis, quiet!" The dog silenced immediately. She shouldn't have been surprised at that. Myron had been the one to train the dog so well. Regis was as much Myron's dog as Grace's. She hurried forward to pull the blanket away. Lily lay beneath, hands and feet bound, a gag in her mouth. Turning a glare on Myron, she snapped, "You're a monster!" "Leave her be. We'll be where we're going in a few minutes." "She's freezing." "It's a sub-zero blanket. She'll be fine." Lily's eyes were wide and terrified, blinking their fear. "At least let me take off the gag." He seemed to consider that, then nodded. "I can be reasonable." Grace didn't bother to argue as she removed the too tight cloth from Lily's face. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Even with the gag removed, Lily only nodded, gaze flicking from Myron to Grace and back. Grace leaned close and whispered so quietly she wasn't even sure Lily would hear. "I called the police. They'll be—" "Enough of that." Myron yanked Grace back with a hand on her shoulder. "Get in." Settled in the passenger seat, Grace turned and patted Lily's hip through the blanket. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Just sit tight." Beside her, Myron gave Grace a pleased look, almost smug. "This is going to be better than okay." He cranked the engine, and it rumbled to life louder than a lawnmower. Didn't he worry about the sound carrying? But the snow muffled everything. And they were pretty far from the condos now. What else was out here? She tried to remember the area around the community she'd called home. There was a neighborhood not too far away, but it was in the opposite direction. If her internal compass was correct, they were headed not parallel to the main road, but deeper into the woods, farther from any structures she'd seen in Coventry. Farther from the lake, farther from town. The trail angled up, and they ascended an incline that had to be the back side of Matt Coventry, the side not facing the lake and the town. The road became steep, the engine roaring to keep up the pace. Except where the headlights cut through the darkness, the night was black. Snow flitted in the bright beams and flew over the vehicle. Cold wind and icy flakes blew through the open sides. Grace turned to the back and saw that Regis had crawled from beneath the blankets and had his paws propped on the edge of the cargo area, looking out at the dark woods as if checking for predators. Lily remained huddled beneath the blanket. Grace patted her hip, and the child pulled the blanket down and peered up at her. The fear had drained from her eyes, replaced by the numb expression she'd worn when Grace had first met her. How quickly, how thoroughly, Lily had been pulled right back into the role Myron had for her, not of treasured daughter, but of valuable commodity. Despite everything Grace had done to try to protect her, she'd failed. She'd utterly, miserably failed. Because, as much as she'd tried to encourage Lily before, she had little hope that the police were going to find them. Myron had planned every step of this. Even on the off chance that somebody had glimpsed them walking into the forest, these woods went on for miles and miles in every direction. They were crisscrossed by logging trails and narrow roads. Grace guessed Myron had a car up ahead. They'd be loaded in and driven away, and nobody would ever know where they'd gone. Lily would once again be used as Myron's meal ticket. Grace. Who knew what would become of her? But based on the threats he'd made and the look in his eyes, Myron had plans for Grace as well. Still, she smiled at Lily, tried to fill her expression with a confidence she didn't feel. She'd been uttering prayers since the first moment she'd realized Lily was gone. A constant stream of please God and help us. Now, she gripped Lily's hip through the blanket and closed her eyes. Lord, you know everything. You are our strong tower, our very present help in times of trouble. We are in deep trouble now. Please, be our help. You are the rescuer. Rescue us. Without you, we are lost. Help me to be what Lily needs right now. Whatever happens, help me shield her, protect her. Help me love her well. If only Andrew had answered the phone. If only she'd had the opportunity to hear his voice one more time. The vehicle hit a bump, and Grace gripped the side to hold steady, not letting go of Lily. Regis bounced and flew off the back. Lily screamed. Grace yelled to be heard over the engine. Regis fell! We have to stop! But Myron only glanced at her, a strange look in his eyes. You have to stop. Lily needs him. Without taking his eyes off the road, Myron smiled. She has you now. She doesn't need the mutt anymore. But he'll freeze to death. Myron only shrugged, never even slowing. Lily's scream died, but she propped herself up to see. Regis ran behind them on the trail. Though Grace couldn't hear him barking, she imagined the sounds in her ears. Protect Regis, Lord. He's been such a good friend to her. They rounded a corner, and Regis disappeared from sight. For the first time since she'd discovered Lily missing, tears filled Grace's eyes. Regis was gone, and Grace feared the dog would be just one of many tragic losses before this was all over. Assuming it ever was over. Chapter 31. Grace didn't know exactly what she'd expected. A car. A long drive. She'd had vague thoughts about being shoved in a trunk. She didn't have irrational fears of small places, but she still didn't relish the idea. She definitely hadn't expected this. Myron had driven them through the thick woods along a trail that twisted switchback style up the mountain. At the top, they'd exited the worn track to a path that seemed barely wide enough for the all-terrain vehicle. That was where she dropped the glove. She'd been thinking about it for miles, thinking that, as long as they stayed on the wide trails, there was a chance they'd be found. But when they left it, that was when things would get dicey. Her hands had been shoved in her jacket pocket, but she managed to get her right glove off. She'd held on to it for what felt like miles and miles and miles. And then, Myron slowed considerably and made a turn, gaze fixed ahead. She'd flicked the glove over the side of the ATV. She didn't dare look to see where it had fallen, praying it had landed in the middle of the path, praying the wind wouldn't blow it away. Not that anybody would think to check the woods behind the condo. Surely the police would start looking on the roadways and highways, not on the four-wheeler paths used for recreation. The path opened to a lonely structure in the middle of nowhere. They approached from the back, where Myron pulled the ATV straight into what looked like a newly constructed shed, likely built for exactly that purpose. Rather than untie Lily, he simply hoisted her into his arms, as if she weighed no more than a sack of groceries, and nodded to the back door. He shone his flashlight that direction, and she saw it was a house. Ladies first! What choice did she have? She started across the snowy yard toward the back door. He tromped behind her. When she reached the door, he said, "Go on in." "It's unlocked. Switch is on the left." She stepped into an empty room, flipped on the light, and crossed it to the far side near the window, putting distancy between herself and Miron. The house was warm, the sound of the furnace humming in the quiet. He angled to get himself and Lily into the house and closed the door with his foot. Holding Lily in one arm, he turned the key already in the keyhole, pulled it out, and pocketed it. The acid in her stomach rumbled in fear. Lily's eyes were open, but Grace saw nothing there. No fight, no light. Lily had resigned herself to this fate. Grace looked around the dilapidated space. Dull and cracked linoleum was coming up from the subfloor at one corner. Based on the tacky, tarnished brass light fixture hanging from the stained ceiling in the center of the room, This was an eating area. It held the sense of mold and dust and something long dead. She peered through an opening on the far side of the room and saw countertops and a stainless refrigerator that looked new. "You like the place?" Myron asked. "It still needs a lot of work. I've focused my efforts elsewhere." He crossed through the dining area and into a hallway, where he pulled open a doorway and yanked a string. A bulb hanging from the ceiling lit up. He turned back to Grace. "I know what you're thinking." She wished she were less predictable in that moment, but she was sure he did. Run. And at the same time, "Lily! Even if you tried it," Myron said, "you'd fail. I haven't done much cosmetic work, but all the windows have been nailed shut. With time and the right tools, maybe you could manage to get one open, but it wouldn't be easy. Sure, you could crack the glass, but you see how it is, all those little panes? These are old windows, and those panes are real. So for instance, those," he gestured to the windows in the small room where they'd just stood, "are actually 9 panes of glass in a wood frame. You'd have to break all 9 panes and then remove the wood in order to get out. Could you do that before I caught you?" He shrugged. "I wouldn't try. Even on the off chance that you got away and didn't freeze to death trying to find help, Lily and I would be long gone by the time anybody got here. And I'd have to punish our sweet Lily for your choices." Still in his arms, Lily didn't react to the words. He lifted her and kissed her forehead, leaving his lips against the child's skin for far too long, never taking his eyes off Grace. "Come on now." His voice was low, almost seductive. "We both know what you're going to do. A woman who blows up her entire life for the sake of a girl she barely knows is not about to give up on her now." Grace stared at the doorway and the void beyond. She could make out the tall walls on either side. It was a staircase to the basement. Something told her that if she went into that basement, she'd never come back out. That the sunshine she'd felt on her face that afternoon had been the last sunshine she'd ever feel. But this was what she'd signed up for. She'd told Andrew she'd give her life to protect Lily. In a million years, she'd never imagined that this was how it would end. Seclusion, probably. Prison, possibly. But being imprisoned by this man? It had never crossed her mind. If it had, back when she'd lived in her cabin in Washington, if she'd known this was the endgame, would she still have snatched Lily and run? She hoped so. She hoped she was that kind of person. Lily was barely responding now. She'd shrunk so deep into herself that Grace hardly recognized her. But the real Lily, her Lily, was still in there. She was still worth fighting for. Grace turned and glanced at the dark windows, wishing she could see the snow falling lightly on the other side. But that didn't matter. All that mattered was staying with Lily, protecting her as best she could. She stalked past Myron and down the steps. Myron clomped behind her, then stepped past her through the dank room. Concrete all around, metal poles reaching from the floor to the beams, supporting the structure. A few wide, squat windows at the top of the walls showed the black night. A brand new washer and dryer sat below one of them. Metal shelving units lined the long back wall, filled with tools and paint cans and cleaning supplies. Still holding Lily, Myron approached the shelving unit, reached through to the back of one of the supports, and lifted a lever. Then he swung the whole thing into the room. It was a door nobody would ever find. He held it open for her. "Welcome home!" With lead in her feet, she stepped through. Myron came in behind her and pulled the door closed. The room was completely dark. In the silence, Lily screamed, a heart-wrenching sound that nearly weakened Grace's knees. "Quiet now!" Myron's words, uttered gently, had the desired effect. Lily had learned to obey him immediately. Overhead fluorescence flickered to life. Unlike the unfinished basement area they'd just left, this space looked shiny and new. White walls, a queen-sized bed, camera equipment all around, screens for backdrops, properties, giant lamps and reflectors, a computer with an oversized screen, cameras mounted on 2 tripods. The studio. Myron opened yet another door, this one metal and equipped with locks. You two will be in here. It's not the nicest accommodations, but it'll work. She stepped inside and stopped in the middle of the room. Two twin beds, a nightstand between them, a bureau, and a normal interior door. She peeked through it. A full bathroom. Everything looked new, from the chrome fixtures in the shower to what she guessed were peel and stick tiles on the floor. Not fancy but clean. A linen closet was stocked with towels, soap, shampoo, even feminine hygiene products. He'd thought of everything. "Come on in and sit down," Myron said. Grace stepped from the bathroom to find Lily on one of the beds. Myron was cutting the duct tape off her hands and feet. "There, sweetheart. That must feel better." Lily stretched her hands and twisted her feet around. Myron lifted her left arm and surveyed the cast. "We're going to have to figure out how to get this off." "The doctor said her arm would be good as new in another week or two," Grace said. Myron stood, the movement so sudden that she took a step back. He crossed the room, not stopping until he was inches from her. "How could you let that happen?" Seriously? The man who'd just tied Lily up and left her to freeze was angry about a broken arm? "It was an accident. Do you have any idea what she's worth? If I find a single mark on her—" "Do you?" Grace should probably shut up, but anger stirred in her chest like a kettle of water coming to a boil. "She's worth far more than you'll ever understand. She's infinitely valuable." "You think I don't know that?" The wild look in Myron's eyes had Grace swallowing. "She's my inspiration, my muse. Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed for her?" "Not for her," Grace said. "For you, for your pocketbook." The anger in his features relaxed, and the expression that replaced it was almost scarier than the rage. "Not for money. It's about so much more than that. You have no idea of my talent, my genius. Someday, Lily's pictures will grace the walls of museums. Someday, they'll see the beauty. The world, with all its puritanical ideals, isn't ready yet. But someday, adults and children alike will gaze at what I've created. She'll be immortalized, as famous as Mona Lisa and far, far more beautiful." "You're insane!" He shook his head. "You're just like the rest of them. You don't understand." He gripped her arm and manhandled her to the bed, where he pushed her to a sitting position. "It doesn't matter if you understand or not. You'll take care of her. You'll make sure no harm comes to her. You'll make her happy." He licked his lips. "I think you'll make us both happy." As cold fear dripped down her back, Grace could think of nothing to say. But Myron turned in a circle, then gave her an expectant look. "Impressive, right?" His moods shifted faster than winds in a storm. "How did you do it so fast?" she asked. Because why not? Why not make conversation? Why not pretend to care? Maybe she could gain his trust. Maybe. She had no idea what to do, what he expected of her, or if she'd be able to provide it. She only knew she was at his mercy. "You were in that condo," he said. "If you'd moved into another hotel, I would have watched and waited. But you seemed pretty settled here from the start. Lily was going to school, so I figured you wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. I could take my time. I rented this place and started preparing it for you." He sat beside Lily and pulled her into his lap. She went willingly, not fighting him, and popped her thumb into her mouth. He settled in to talk. "I made myself a fixture in town. The new guy who'd just moved here from Windham, working on my vacation home, hoping to get it ready for spring. Chatted up the locals. I fit right in. Had a contractor out to give me an estimate on the kitchen. He already updated my bathroom." He looked around the space, pride puffing his chest. "Did this myself, of course. Couldn't have anybody figuring out my secret." He knocked on the wall behind him. "Completely soundproof. I could have the whole Coventry PD on the other side of this wall, and you could scream your head off, and they'd never hear you." He turned back to her with a proud smile. "Even went to the Patriot for lunch today. I had a nice chat with James. You know James, right? Married to Cassidy? She's the reason you're here. I needed to know if you'd told them about me, but James was oblivious. Andrew probably knows about me, but it doesn't matter. I've been trying to figure you out all along. Ever since the first time I followed Lily to your house, I've been trying to get to know you, to find out what kind of person you are. Going through your things, moving your things. It was all just a ruse to see how you'd react. Watching people, filming people. It's what I do. What was he saying? He was the one who'd been messing with her things? That day he'd shown up at her place to get Lily, claiming Lily hadn't told him where she'd gone. Lily hadn't told him, but he'd known. So you're saying, she tried to reconcile his words with what she knew. When my hairbrush went missing in Denver, that was me, of course. Every place you've been, I've been. The cameras you saw today? I had 'em at your cabin in Washington, at that extended stay hotel in Kansas City. Except places you only stayed a night or two, I installed cameras. She closed her eyes, accepting the horror of it. How many times had she accused Lily? Had Lily known? Maybe not for sure, but perhaps she'd guessed. When the laptop went missing and then showed up, Lily had seemed afraid. Grace glanced at the girl, who hadn't reacted to anything Myron said. She'd checked out. Maybe it was better that way. Grace wished she were as oblivious. You took the laptop, she said. After your little jaunt to Texas, I needed to know what you'd learned. It definitely stepped up my timetable. I still didn't plan to make a move for a couple of weeks. I figured with Darla dead. She's not dead. Maybe Grace shouldn't have said it, but the man was so smug, so sure of himself. He waved off her words with a flick of his wrist. Of course she is. She's in the hospital, but she's gonna make it. And she knows I have Lily. She and her family aren't going to stop until they find her. Myron took that information in with narrowed, assessing eyes. After a moment, he shook it off. Doesn't matter. They'll never find you. See, the key is to always do the unexpected. For instance, I know you called your boyfriend earlier. But despite the car in the parking lot, he wasn't home. He was in Plymouth, just like he said he'd be. No idea why his car was there, but I've been watching the camera in his place all day. No movement. So I wasn't worried when you called him. He's probably at your place now. It's gotta be crawling with cops. They'll start canvassing the neighbors. Know what they'll find out? Though she'd figured the question was rhetorical, he seemed to be waiting for an answer. What? There's been a suspicious van. He made air quotes with his fingers. In the area. Missouri plates. I bought it back when you were in Kansas City. Drove it up here. But when I've been going back and forth to town, I've been driving my boring black Honda Accord with the New Hampshire plates. I'm guessing the police have put out a BOLO on the van. They'll find it parked in a lot in Manchester. That's where they'll hit a dead end. Best part of my plan? We stay right here. They'll be chasing their tails all over the state, and we'll be right here, just a few miles away, and nobody'll ever know. Again, he paused to give her a moment to react. He'd obviously been dying to tell somebody how clever he was. Did he really expect her to praise his ingenuity? If there's nothing else, she said, Lily needs her rest. He glared through narrowed eyes. She should play along. If she wasn't rescued soon, she'd have to learn to. But she didn't have it in her tonight. Because he was right. Nobody would find them. If she couldn't figure a way out of the windowless room, that basement with the metal doors and the heavy deadbolts, she and Lily would be at this man's mercy forever.
Chapter 32. Andrew stood in the parking lot between his and Grace's condos and watched the activity. Cops had swarmed in, some in uniform, others in plain clothes. Some of the uniformed ones were knocking on doors, others going in and out of Grace's place, seemingly doing nothing. Not nothing, surely. An older, overweight man who'd introduced himself as chief or sheriff or something was snapping orders and making calls. Fitz and Dylan had introduced themselves and offered their aid. Dylan had jogged away to help with the canvassing. Fitz had gone inside. The rest of Andrew's friends, Braden, Reed, Garrett, Thomas, and James, were there, primed to jump in. But there was nothing to do. Grace and Lily were gone. The first cops had entered through the unlocked back door, where the video doorbell had been broken. He'd told one of the cops about that, and the guy'd given him a knowing look. A look that said, if only you'd replaced it immediately. Nobody needed to say the words. Andrew'd failed them. He knew that. He knew. Braden's hand gripped his shoulder. but Andrew stepped away. Don't. I can't. I understand. Maybe he did. He'd faced something with Carly. Andrew'd never gotten the details, but Carly had been taken, and Braden had feared he'd never see her again. But pain wasn't like spare parts, interchangeable. Pain was uniquely designed for the person who experienced it. So no, Braden didn't understand how he felt. He didn't understand the regret settling in Andrew's being like tar, so sticky and heavy it would never be scraped away. Dylan jogged down the sidewalk and approached the one in charge as if he had information. Andrew moved that direction, desperate for news. A navy blue van, Missouri plates. Dylan rattled off the plate number, and the chief sheriff guy repeated the information into a phone. When Dylan turned to Andrew, he had a look on his face that made Andrew's heart pound. Hope. The man had hope. Andrew needed it, desperately. Lady on the next block said she's seen a van around. A few others mentioned it as well. Nobody ever saw anybody get in or out. It was picked up on her security camera, so we were able to pull a plate number. Great. It's a good lead, Dylan said. Chief Coates already put out a BOLO, a be on the lookout. Someone will see it. Chief Coate, he was the guy in charge. She saw the van tonight? Andrew asked. Dylan shook his head. But that doesn't mean anything. He probably just parked somewhere else tonight, maybe somewhere closer. I figure they went out the back door, crossed the little yard, and went around to the front of one of the condos on the other side of the development. We're knocking on doors, seeing if anybody saw anything. We'll find them. Andrew wanted to feel the hope that Dylan obviously felt. He tried to conjure it, but the truth was too strong. This guy, he won't be that easy to find. Dylan's eyes narrowed. Why do you say that? Let's say you're right, that the van belonged to Myron Bowman. That means he's been here for days. Why wait until tonight? And why be so obvious? I mean, could he drive a more suspicious vehicle than a dark van with out-of-state plates? Andrew shook his head. No, if it was him, then it was a ruse. Not all criminals are masterminds, Dylan said. Most aren't all that smart at all. But Bowman had managed to pass Lily off as his daughter for years, and nobody had known. He'd managed to find Grace and Lily, despite all of Grace's precautions. This guy is, though. He's smart. But he was rushed, Dylan said. The boxes. You saw the boxes, right? Andrew didn't want to think about those boxes, all stacked neatly by the front door. He must have known she was packing, Dylan said. He didn't want to lose her again. Nobody had asked Andrew about that. Though all his friends had to have been wondering, not one had brought up the obvious fact that Grace had been about to move away for good. Do you think she saw him? Dylan asked. Was that why she was leaving? Grace found Lily's grandmother. She was taking her there. It's one thing to take a trip to Texas, Dylan said. It's another thing to relocate permanently, unless she wanted to stay near her, or was she going to fight for custody or something? None of what had transpired between himself and Grace would make any difference in finding her. He didn't say anything. Chief Coate called, "O'Donnell!" Dylan turned back to the chief and they moved away from Andrew. He should stay close, listen to what they were saying. But for what purpose? They knew what they were doing. At this point, Andrew could offer nothing of value. His other friends surrounded him again. He needed air. He needed to think and pray and be alone. He brushed past the guys and marched to the end of the row of condos, turned toward the back and walked around to her door. It was quieter back there. Though lights were on in condos all around, the police hadn't worried about waking the neighbors. He didn't see a soul. He stared at Grace's tiny yard, his breath fogging in the frigid air. If there'd been footprints, they were gone now, all covered by a growing layer of snow. He spun slowly. A car could have been parked in any of the lots, or down by the playground. Not a suspicious van, but something nobody would look twice at. A distant noise had him turning toward the woods. There was nothing back there. Nothing for miles and miles and miles. Yet, was that a dog barking? He tried to make out shapes, seeing trees and more trees, wondering if he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. His dress shoes were not designed to traverse snow-covered fields, but he ignored the cold seeping through the Italian leather and started toward the sound. The ambient light from the condo complex reflected off the fresh snow. He was still a good 50 yards away when he saw the outline of a small dog. He jogged toward it. The dog didn't run his direction, though, just stayed where it was, barking all the more. Was there something there? A body? Andrew's stomach twisted. Bowman was only after Lily. Grace was disposable, and she'd caused him worlds of trouble. Please, God, don't let her be dead. But what would keep the dog out there, on this frigid night, except one of the people it loved? Andrew slowed as he approached, afraid the little spaniel would bolt. Was it? He inched closer and realized it was definitely Lily's dog. He called, "Regis, come!" The animal didn't move closer, and its barks only became more furious. Andrew approached, but when he got within a few feet, Regis dashed into the woods. Andrew followed, looking around but seeing nothing unusual. He pulled in a breath and blew it out with a prayer of gratitude. Not a body, not yet anyway. Garrett's voice came from behind him. "That the girl's dog?" He turned to see that Garrett and Thomas had been following at a distance. "I have no idea where it's going." He stepped into the woods. Behind him, Thomas made a call, telling somebody what they were doing. "It's probably nothing," Andrew said to Garrett, but hope pounded a drum in his chest. Why would the dog be in the woods? He was a good dog, a smart dog. Okay, he wasn't Lassie. They weren't about to find Timmy at the bottom of a well. But Regis was loyal. He loved his girls. If Lily and Grace had gone this way, maybe Regis could lead Andrew to them. Anyway, he had to do something. He started down the path, but Garrett's grip on his arm stopped him. "Let's run back and get the four-wheelers from the shed." Garrett did enough work for the development that they'd given him keys. "We're not going to be able to go faster than the dog," Andrew said. "What difference will it make? You never know what we're going to find. Better to have them and not need them than need them and not have them." Andrew scooped the dog up and followed Garrett and Thomas to the shed. 7 minutes later, Andrew set the dog, who'd been practically snarling at him the entire trip to get the machines, back down on the path. Regis bolted into the woods. Andrew took the lead in his ATV, and Garrett and Thomas followed. They were both dressed for the occasion, wearing jeans and a winter coat and boots. When Andrew had first arrived home, someone had gone into his place and found his wool overcoat, so at least he had that. No hat and gloves, though, and his thin suit pants weren't exactly weather appropriate. His fingers were so cold, they felt like they were going to freeze and fall right off his body. They rode slowly, barely faster than if they were walking, following the dog. 10 minutes passed. 20. And then Regis stopped in the middle of a clearing. He turned in a circle, sat on his haunches, and whined. Andrew braked, peering into the darkness. There was nothing there. Nothing but trees, trees, and more trees. He approached the dog and looked down at it. Where are they? Somehow, Lassie would have found a way to answer. While Garrett and Thomas climbed off their four-wheeler, Andrew walked around the edge of the clearing. He turned to Garrett, who was standing in the middle of the space, but his friend only shrugged. Andrew glared at the dog again. "What is this supposed to be? Some kind of clue?" Fury rose, heating him far more than the coat did. Garrett and Thomas watched, saying nothing. "Sorry I dragged you guys." But he caught sight of something. Maybe it was the angle, maybe the different perspective. He stalked across the clearing and peered down at the mostly snow-covered ground. But it wasn't all covered yet. A lot of the snow had settled on branches and needles overhead. He pulled out his phone and aimed its flashlight, bending to see better. It was a muddy spot at the edge of the path, and there was the distinct impression of a tire. Thomas crouched beside him. "Four-wheeler?" Shrugging, Andrew stood and looked for more tracks. The path itself was covered with snow, but here on the edge, he saw another impression in the leafy bracken. "I think he turned around here." "If it was him," Garrett said, "people use these trails all the time." "I know," Thomas said, "but the dog led us here. There must be a reason. It can't be a coincidence." "It could be, though. God, now'd be a great time for you to light a path or speak through the dog. Would that be so hard? You made a donkey talk." God was silent, and Regis only panted after the long run, but Garrett was nodding. "So the guy parked here, got the girls, and walked them back through the woods to this spot, got on a vehicle and drove where?" He looked around, but there was nothing in any direction. Thomas was staring at the trail that continued up the backside of the mountain. "Further," he said. Garrett yanked his phone from his pocket. Swore. No service. Andrew checked too and got the same result. Thomas said, nothing. Andrew walked a few feet farther on the path, the dog at his side. Regis was letting him lead now, as if he knew where he was going. He'd probably only get them lost. The thought had him yanking his phone from his pocket again. He might not have phone service, but the GPS should work. He had an app that tracked his jogs. He turned it on so he'd have an idea of where he'd already looked. He studied the map to get a sense of where he was. No landmarks, no roads, no nothing for miles and miles. But there had to be something. There had to be. We should go back until we get service, Thomas said. Call and let the police know what we found. I'm not going back. Andrew settled Regis on the ATV's seat and climbed on next to him. The dog was no tracker, but maybe he could be of help. You two let them know what I'm doing. What are you planning? Thomas asked. This has to lead somewhere. Thomas and Garrett shared a look. Thomas said, these trails go all over the mountain. We're going to need help. Fine, go get help. I'll be out here until I find them. Thomas whipped his gloves off his hands and held them out. I'll have someone bring me a pair. Andrew took them and yanked them on. Thanks. Thomas pulled something else from one of his parka's pockets. He extended it to Andrew. A handgun. You know how to use that? Andrew took the weapon. He didn't know enough about guns to know the caliber or make or anything like that, but he knew how to check the safety in the magazine. It was fully loaded. One in the chamber, Thomas said. Don't use it unless you have no choice. I'll be back with help. If you find them, sit tight and wait. Let the police handle it. Good advice, but it came from a guy who'd given him a gun. Mixed messages at best. Andrew shoved the gun in his pocket. He was about to get moving when Garrett lifted the dog and sat in his seat, settling Regis on his lap. Let's go. Andrew wasn't sorry for the company. Thomas lifted a hand and Andrew gunned the engine. He had no idea what he was driving them into, but he couldn't worry about Garrett or himself at this point. If Grace and Lily were at the end of this trail, Andrew would find them or die trying.
Chapter 33. Grace got Lily to brush her teeth and change into pajamas Myron had left in the bureau, along with neatly folded jeans and sweaters. He'd bought clothes for Grace as well, but she wasn't about to put them on. She tucked Lily into one of the twin beds and read to her from a book he'd left in a nightstand drawer. The nighttime routine felt surreal, and as little as Grace wanted to get comfortable, to play into Myron's bizarre plan, Lily needed normalcy. She needed to feel comfortable and safe, even if she wasn't. Grace didn't know what else to do. When the book was finished, Lily said her prayers, asking God to bless each of her friends, her teacher, Grace, and Andrew. When she prayed he'd protect Regis, her monotone voice cracked. Grace laid beside her, wrapped her arms around her, and sang a lullaby. Long after Lily's breathing evened out, Grace stayed, needing the child's presence probably as much as Lily needed hers. When she was sure Lily was in a deep sleep, she prowled the room, opening every drawer, checking every cabinet. She needed a weapon, something heavy or something sharp, anything she could use to take Myron out. If he were wounded badly enough, she could search his pockets, get the keys, and get them out of there. She could see no other way of escape. She was sitting on the bathroom floor, looking through the first aid kit she'd found in the cabinet beneath the sink, hoping for a pair of scissors to cut gauze or medical tape, when the door creaked. Expecting Lily, she pasted on a smile and looked up. Myron was leaning against the jamb. It came with scissors. I took 'em out. It was a conundrum I had to solve. If one of you gets hurt and I'm not down here, how can you let me know? I didn't want to risk an intercom. What if you used it when somebody was here? His smile was relaxed and confident. The first aid kit should work until I check on you. She shoved it back in the cabinet and closed the cabinet door softly. You should keep your voice down so you don't wake her. She's a heavy sleeper, Myron said. You must have learned that by now. Still. Her voice trailed as Myron stepped closer to her and held out his hand. Come on. He wiggled his fingers. I don't bite. She pushed off the floor and stood without taking his hand. You're a stubborn one, aren't you? The bathroom was already small, and with him in there, the the walls inched inward. She moved back, but bumped into the edge of the tub. He moved closer. "That's okay." His voice was low, seductive. "Lily was stubborn once, too. She learned. You'll learn." He took Grace's hand, and she saw again all the images she'd seen in the spring. Lily in pose after pose after pose. There were other children as well, but the bulk of the images were Lily. She felt Myron's triumph, his pride, his arrogance, his sheer and shocking narcissism. The man truly believed he was unique, special, set apart from the rest of humanity. And he was. But it was his depravity that set him apart. To Myron, his photographs of children were art, a gift to the world. She yanked her hand away and sucked in a deep breath. She needed space, but he was right there, watching her through narrowed eyes. "What was that about?" "I don't like to hold hands," she said. "It makes me feel weird." Lily's words. "Why?" "It goes back to my childhood," she said. "Everything will be better if you don't hold my hand. Okay?" Still, the eyes were narrowed. "You'd think, with your psychology background, you'd have gotten over that. But you never earned more than a bachelor's, right?" He backed up, and she pulled in a deep breath, as if she'd been deprived of oxygen. "Me? I never needed college. They didn't have anything to teach me of import. I was always better than my teachers at the only thing that mattered, capturing beauty through photography." He backed to the bathroom door. "Come on!" "Where are we going?" He offered no explanation, just waited for her to comply with his commands. She stepped past him into the small bedroom, where Lily was sound asleep. But Myron didn't stop there. He pulled open the metal door. It didn't seem to be locked, and led the way into the studio. She froze at the entrance. "What do you want?" "Pull that door closed," he said. "She's a sound sleeper, but we don't want to take any chances." Grace did as Myron asked. Anything to protect Lily. The door closed with a click. She pushed, and it opened again. "We won't keep it locked when we're out here. We need access to her, and she to us. She is just a child, after all." A smile spread across his face. "You're fortunate, Grace Mullen. If you were ugly or fat or old, if you didn't have so much going for you, I'd have killed you in the woods and left your body for the birds. But you're attractive. You're not like Lily, of course. You're not perfect. And you're not like me, obviously." "Like him in what respect? Insane? Egomaniacal?" "But you've been a good mother to Lily," he said. "I'm going to let you continue in that role. We're going to be a family, the three of us. And we're going to be happy." He clicked on a lamp aimed at the bed, which shone in the glare. He looked through the lens of a camera on a tripod, adjusting a few settings. He didn't look at her when he said, "Don't worry. I just want to get a sense of the potential. I'm not sure yet how I'll use you." When he glanced her way, a gleam lit his eyes. "I mean, I have some idea, but I'm talking about merchandise." He added a wink, as if it might put her at ease. Every nerve in her body trembled. She would scream if she could get the sound to carry up her throat. A pathetic squeak issued from her mouth. She backed up a step, then another. Looked around for something, anything to use as a weapon. She reached for a black pole leaning against the wall. It was a couple of inches in diameter, probably a part to one of his many stage lights or easels. She lifted it. But he was there, his hands wrapping around her from behind. "I'll need to be more careful about what I leave lying around." He removed the pole from her hands and let it fall to the concrete floor, where it clanked as it bounced. "Good thing we closed that door." Myron's breath was hot against her ear. Now would be a very inopportune time for Lily to wake up. He gripped Grace's arm. "Come on, onto the bed for me." She stopped at the edge, her body refusing her brain's commands. "It would be better for you," Myron leaned close, "if you'd do what I say, and better for Lily." Lily. This was all about Lily. She sat on the mattress. Mercifully, Myron returned to the camera. "Beautiful," he said. "You look so—" He snapped a few photos, then leaned out and leered at her. "You know what I'm going to do to you, don't you?" Cold fear had her crossing her arms. "I love that," he said, snapping more pictures. The fear is palpable. He kept talking, telling her the things he planned for her, for them. The more he talked, the more excited he became, the more photos he snapped. She kept sitting there, apparently looking exactly as he wanted her to look. She had no idea what he was seeing through that camera lens, but she assumed the vision he had barely resembled the truth. There was no beauty in this moment, only fear and horror on her part, ego and lust on his. But she'd play along. The longer he spent on the far side of the camera, the better.
Chapter 34. Andrew almost missed it. At first he'd thought it was a leaf, but as he'd approached, as the headlights on the four-wheeler had illuminated it better, he'd realized what it was. He parked and swept the item off the ground. "What is it?" Garrett asked. He held the thin leather glove up for his friend to see. "It's hers." "You're sure?" Grace had worn these gloves at Dad's birthday party. Thank God it hadn't been covered in snow. He lifted it to his face and breathed in the scent. It didn't smell like Grace. This wasn't the movies or some romance flick. It wasn't even warm. But knowing she'd been there, right there, where was she now? He gazed at the thick woods all around. The path continued further up the mountain, but if Myron had taken her that way, then why drop the glove here? Why not a mile back or a mile forward? There was a reason. Regis hopped from the four-wheeler and ran up and down the trail, pausing often to sniff, acting as frantic as Andrew felt. Garrett, on the other hand, was gazing deep into the woods. That way, he pointed to the right, leads to more trails. He turned to face the woods to the left. "I have no idea what's in that direction." While he spoke, Regis ran into the woods not far from where Garrett had just indicated. Andrew followed, pushing a low-hanging branch out of the way. "There's a path here." He crouched down, studying the ground. Maybe tracks, maybe wishful thinking. Still, this had to be the way. He yanked out his phone to call the police. Still no service. He approached the four-wheeler. "Come on!" "Hold up," Garrett said. "If Thomas gets the cops to follow us, we need to show what direction we've gone." They found some fallen branches in the woods and dragged them back to the trail. Together, they arranged the branches in a very crude arrow pointing to the path. Garrett stepped back. "No way they'll miss that." Andrew peered into the darkness ahead. How far would they have to go from there? If they took the ATV, would Myron hear them coming? But it could be miles further. What to do? Before he voiced the question, Garrett said, "I think speed trumps stealth." He didn't say what Andrew was thinking, that Bowman had a good lead, that most likely all they'd find was an empty road. Most likely they were already too late. "Lead us, Father. Take us to them." 20 minutes later, the ATV bounced in a hole in the middle of the woods and stopped. Andrew cut the engine. Garrett jumped off to survey the damage. "I think we're stuck. There's that higher education at work." Andrew climbed off the machine to confirm what he already knew. Up ahead, the trees were too close together to maneuver the ATV through anyway. The ground too covered in brush. Somewhere he'd lost the trail. Had it been seconds before or minutes? He'd been certain he was going the right way, and then worried. And now? He muttered a curse word under his breath, feeling the need to be quiet despite the fact that the overloud ATV would have announced their presence for miles. "It can't be too far behind us," Garrett said. "We could push the thing out and backtrack." The area was too narrow to turn the vehicle around, assuming they could get it out of the hole. The dog scampered beside him. "Which way, Regis?" But the dog just whined. "Lassie, you are not." Andrew lifted his phone, praying he'd have service. No deal. He lit the flashlight and aimed ahead. Maybe the path had veered one direction or another, but they weren't far from it. Best case scenario, just go forward. If Myron had brought them up here, surely there was a road somewhere. Idiot. Shaking his head, he navigated to the app he'd opened earlier, which marked the route he'd taken. According to it, he'd gone more than 5 miles. But to where? He expanded the map to get a wider view and found a road. It wasn't named, but he saw a winding absence of trees that indicated something. He held the screen out for Garrett. About a half-mile ahead. Garrett took the phone from his hand, then looked around as if there might be a road sign somewhere. "I think I just figured out where we are." "Yeah?" He looked at the screen to see what his friend was seeing. but nothing had changed. There's a house up here, dilapidated and in desperate need of work, but it's got great bones. I tried to buy it to fix up and sell. The owner lives in Hawaii, so I figured he'd be eager to get it off his hands. I reached out to him, but he wasn't willing to let it go. Must have history with the place or something. When was this? 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months. Andrew tapped the screen. Where is it? Garrett shifted the map this way and that, then held it out to him and pointed to a spot on the screen. It's hard to see, but I think that's it. Less than half a mile away. Let's go. They'd been walking for what felt like an hour when his flashlight beam bounced off something metal. It was a detached garage with a side door. Quietly, he opened that door and saw a Polaris inside, one of those fancy off-the-road vehicles. His heart pounded a steady stream of hope. He turned to see Garrett at the edge of the structure, facing away. He joined him. A house in the middle of nowhere. This is it, Garrett said. Light shone through a downstairs window. More light seemed to come out of the ground. The basement. The lights were on in the basement. The rest of the house was dark. They're here, he said. Garrett nodded but said, maybe. Andrew checked his phone. Still no service. Well, he wasn't about to sit there and wait for help to arrive. If Grace was there, he was going to find her. He pulled the handgun from his pocket and slid the safety off. Garrett gripped his arm. What are you doing? I'm getting inside that house. What do you think? You can't just break in, man. We don't know for sure that there's an ATV in there. If they're not here now, they were at some point. Maybe, but what if you're wrong? If he was wrong, then it would be breaking and entering. I'll apologize and explain, and hope they go easy on me. Dude, you're gonna land yourself behind bars. Andrew winced at the thought. He'd told Grace his biggest fear was going back to prison. Turned out he'd been wrong about that. He was living his biggest fear. If they didn't find Grace and Lily, he'd never get over it. He studied the house. Breaking down a door would be loud, and who knew what Bowman would do if he heard the noise. They needed a distraction,